Sound, faint wind across an empty battlefield. The metallic rattle of a single loose shell casing. Silence. Then the distant moan of thunder. Narrator somber, measured. In war, silence can be more terrifying than the sound of gunfire. There are nights when the world seems to hold its breath, when every soldier feels that something unseen is moving in the dark. During the winter of 1944, as the Allied forces pushed deeper into the heart of occupied Europe, they came upon a night unlike any other. A night when the German guns, the thunder of the Reich, simply vanished. No shells, no fire, no sound, just an impossible silence, stretching across miles of front line. What they discovered when dawn finally broke would leave even the most hardened men questioning what war itself had become. The quiet. Before the end, it was late December 1944, the Western Front had frozen under a layer of white frost. And across Belgium's Ardennes forest, both sides waited, in uneasy stillness. The Battle of the Bulge was raging to the south, but here near the small town of Hirchen, the guns had fallen silent. British and American scouts had reported German movements days earlier, yet now, as midnight approached, there was nothing. No lights, no distant rumble of artillery wheels, no sign of the massive batteries that had once rained destruction upon their positions. Captain Howard Grant of the 5th Field Regiment would later write in his diary, "It felt as if the world had ended, and we were standing in its ashes." The silence was not peace. It was the kind that hums in the bones, the kind that comes before something terrible. The men in the trenches whispered theories. The Germans were retreating. They were regrouping. They were preparing an ambush. Yet reconnaissance flights? That morning showed empty fields where entire artillery divisions had been positioned the day before. Gun pits lay abandoned, tracks in the snow leading into the forest, but no guns, no crews. For the first time since D-Day, the Allied forward, observers could hear the wind moving through trees without the constant rhythm of shells screaming overhead. Even nature seemed hesitant, as if afraid to break the silence that the war had forgotten to fill. Shadows in the trees by dawn, patrols moved cautiously through the frozen woodland. The ground was littered with fragments, empty ammunition, crates, broken treads, frostbitten ration tins. But the biggest mystery was the precision. There were no signs of panic, no hasty retreat, no dead left behind. The German artillery positions looked as though they had been methodically erased. Radio operators tried to raise headquarters for new orders, but the static on the lines only deepened the dread. When they finally established contact, the response was simple: hold your position. Intelligence will investigate. Hours later, a small reconnaissance unit led by Lieutenant Daniel Wren pushed deeper into the woods. They expected mines or snipers, but what they found was stranger. In the heart of the forest near a frozen stream stood a line of perfectly leveled earth mounds, empty. Each one had been dug with care, lined with planks, camouflaged with branches, yet not a single gun remained. In their place were shallow depressions in the snow, as if something massive had been lifted away without leaving a trace. No vehicle tracks led in or out. It was as though the artillery had simply dissolved into the night. That evening, the sky turned a pale orange, the reflection of distant fires from other fronts. The men stared eastward, waiting for the inevitable counter-bombardment. None came. The silence stretched through the night again, and somewhere in that stillness, a rumor began to spread of an experimental German operation, of weapons hidden beneath the ground, or of a new type of camouflage that could make entire divisions disappear. The ghost guns of Hirchen back in London. British intelligence had already been intercepting strange German communications for weeks, messages referring to Operation Nebel, literally, the fog hand. It was believed to involve mobile artillery units capable of vanishing from reconnaissance view. The theory sounded absurd, but the German High Command had a history of impossible engineering. From jet aircraft to rocket bombardments, nothing seemed beyond their reach. In truth, the disappearance of the artillery was part of a desperate strategy conceived months earlier, as the Allies closed in from the west and Soviet forces advanced. From the east, Germany's military engineers sought new ways to defend their dwindling territories. The idea was simple but revolutionary: to build underground gun chambers, mobile on-rail mounts, capable of firing from below the surface, their barrels emerging through camouflaged panels before retracting again into the earth. They called them Erdkanon, designed in secret under orders from the Waffenamt in late 1943. These subterranean guns could vanish completely between bombardments, hidden under layers of reinforced soil and vegetation. But this new form of defense came with an eerie side effect: total silence. When the Allied patrols entered those forests, they walked over the sealed steel plates of buried bunkers without realizing it. Below their feet, empty tunnels stretched for miles, once filled with machinery and crews, now abandoned. The German engineers who built them had fled days earlier. After receiving encrypted orders to dismantle and destroy all experimental systems, yet some of these tunnels were never destroyed. They remained intact, silent, and waiting. The night the silence began. Eyewitness accounts from German survivors later revealed the truth of that night. On December 21, 1944, an order had been transmitted across the artillery network: cease fire, withdraw under Nebelam Protocol, in one underground command room beneath the Ardennes. Major Erich Bauer listened as the voice of his commanding officer crackled through the static. "The Reich will shift its thunder elsewhere," the voice said. "You will leave nothing behind." For days, the crews had lived like ghosts under the earth, rarely seeing daylight, surrounded by condensation dripping from steel walls. The air was thick with oil and dust. Many soldiers believed the subterranean fortresses to be cursed. When the silence came, one German gunner later recalled, it felt like the war itself had stopped breathing. One by one, the power systems were shut down. The generators fell silent, the ventilation ceased, and the tunnels grew colder. The soldiers packed what they could, covering the entrances with soil and snow, leaving behind the massive cannons they had once tended like beasts. By midnight, the last trucks rolled away, under the cover of fog. Above ground, the Allied lookouts saw only empty fields and frozen air. The silence that followed was not accidental. It was a message. The Germans wanted their absence to be felt, a vanishing act, designed to confuse and unsettle the enemy. In the confusion that followed, Allied command assumed the artillery had retreated east to reinforce the Siegfried Line. But what no one realized was that hundreds of tons of machinery still slept beneath the frozen ground, sealed away in chambers that, even now, decades later, remain undiscovered. The discovery, when the war finally ended. Most reports of vanished artillery were dismissed as confusion or miscommunication amid the chaos of the Western Front, but in 1947, during reconstruction work near the same forest, engineers uncovered something extraordinary. Beneath 10 feet of soil lay a massive steel plate, rusted but intact. When it was pried open, they discovered a tunnel descending into the earth. At its end stood the remains of a colossal artillery piece mounted on a rail carriage. Its barrel shattered, its breech filled with concrete. Around it lay helmets, oxygen canisters, and signs of hasty abandonment. Military historians later confirmed that this was part of Project Nibelheim, one of several hidden artillery systems scattered across western Germany and eastern Belgium. But even more disturbing were the soundproofing experiments found in the documents nearby. The Germans had been testing methods to muffle the acoustic signature of artillery fire using underground chambers, adjustable vents, and chemical dampers. In the air, their goal was to create silent bombardment zones, positions where massive cannons could fire without betraying their location. The science was never perfected, but the results were enough to confuse Allied detection systems in the final months of the war. For the soldiers who had lived through that strange winter night, the discovery offered little comfort. They remembered the silence, not as stratagem, but as haunting an unnatural pause in the chaos of battle. Some swore they heard faint echoes underground days later, like distant thunder trapped beneath the frozen soil. The legacy of silence after the war. Allied intelligence declassified several reports detailing captured German engineering plans. Among them was a file labeled G12, Akustische Tarnung, Akusta Camouflage. It contained diagrams showing entire artillery divisions built beneath terrain mounds, with retractable gun barrels and false surface terrain painted to blend perfectly with aerial photographs. The documents mentioned a term repeatedly: Schweigen, the field of silence. It was the Germans' code name for zones where their sound masking experiments had succeeded. Historians still debate whether the technology truly worked, or if the silence the Allies experienced was the result of chaos, retreat, or destroyed communication lines. Yet there's no denying the psychological power it carried. Soldiers conditioned to constant bombardment felt an unbearable unease in its absence. One British sergeant described it best in a post-war interview. "We could fight the noise, but we couldn't fight the quiet. It made us imagine the worst, like the whole world was watching us, waiting to strike." The field of silence was a prelude to something greater. In the decades that followed, both NATO and Soviet scientists studied acoustic masking, an underground artillery storage, inspired by those lost blueprints. Many Cold War bunkers owe their design to those forgotten German fortifications buried under the Ardennes, and perhaps, in some distant forest, one or two of those guns still remain, sealed in time monuments to a war that tried to make even its destruction invisible. This strange silence before the bombardment in the end, what truly haunted the men who lived through that night was not what they found, but what they didn't. The silence became part of them, a reminder that war is not only measured in explosions and blood, but in the spaces between. Captain Grant would write in his memoir years later, "The guns vanished without a sound, but their silence stayed with us. It followed us home, into the years of peace, into our dreams." Decades later, hikers in the forests of Hirchen still report finding strange metal fragments half buried in moss, some marked with faded German serial numbers. The ground, they say, hums faintly in winter, as if the earth itself remembers the machines once buried beneath it. The silence before the bombardment, that impossible, echoing pause remains one of the most chilling mysteries of the Second World War. For some, it was strategy. For others, it was fear. But for the soldiers who stood there that night, waiting for thunder that never came, it was something deeper. A feeling that the war, for a single breath of time, had looked back at them and decided to disappear. Sound. The faint whistle of distant wind. A single artillery shell clinks against stone, then fades into silence. Narrator softly. And so the night ended, not with fire, but with nothing. In that nothingness, history held its breath, and the world listened to, with the sound of war, finally, going quiet.